everybody. Good afternoon. And you also
Good
say
afternoon.
good afternoon. Every year, we in the Ancient Studies Department are immensely gratified to see the number of people who come to Ancient Studies Week events, especially this annual lecture, which for a long time has been co-sponsored first by the Humanities Forun and now by the James M. and Virginia T. Drescher Center for the Humanities, as well as the Office of Summer, Winter, and Special Programs. Additional thanks for this lecture go to the Department of Visual Arts, both for their contribution and the mentoring and teaching of Dr. Perminda Jacob. Also I'd like to extend thanks to the Friends of the Library and the Drescher Center again for helping to sponsor the lecture that was presented last week in conjunction with the exhibit that you see around you. And perhaps most of all, I'd like to thank Mary Welsh, the Administrative Assistant of the Ancient Studies Department, who has made sure that this lecture and Ancient Studies Week events run smoothly. And I should insert right now that we have 3 places left on our bus trip to the National Gallery on Friday to see the exhibit that the speaker has curated. So if you haven't yet gotten a ticket to go up to the Ancient Studies Department. You may be one of the 3 lucky people to get on the bus and go to the National Gallery with us. This impressive attendance demonstrates the strong interest of the UMBC community in the arts and humanities, and certainly contradicts the perceptions that we are solely a science and technology institution. Thanks to a gift from the Dreschers and the creation of the new Drescher Center for the Humanities, this misperception is certainly going to be corrected. We're also lucky to host Dr. Mattusch's lecture in the Library Gallery, where the exhibit, The Creative Photograph in Archaeology, brought to UMBC by Dr. Richard Mason, is hanging on the walls, and I hope you will have a chance to look at these photographs. Both the exhibit that you see around you and the lecture that you are about to hear highlight the interdisciplinarity that's to be found in the Ancient Studies Department. From archaeology and the study of material remains, both the monuments we see on the wall and the villas of Vesuvius that we will hear about, to the explanation of the material remains using surviving ancient texts, to the citing of the materials in historical context. Also, both the exhibit and Dr. Mattusch's lecture shed light on 2 career paths that are part of our major: practicing archaeology in the field and in cultural resource management, and curatorial studies. And here I have to stop ever so briefly and praise the presentations of our student interns in curatorial studies that were presented this afternoon in this library gallery. Their research has produced fascinating analyses, and I'd like to, student interns, if any of you here, will you please stand up? These interns did a wonderful job, and you may be able, if you identify them now and catch them after the lecture, ask them to tell you about their particular photographer and their particular photographs. Thank you. These students are beginning their careers, and Dr. Mattusch is a model that they can follow. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Mattusch. We have known each other since we were undergraduates, long enough ago that we are becoming antiquities ourselves. Dr. Mattusch's place in the study of classical sculpture is well known. When she and I began our courses in classical sculpture, we were trained in a discipline that had its roots in the study of art history. And this art historical approach was based in part on the antiquarian interests of aristocratic collectors and then on those of the newly established great museums of Europe. Dr. Mattusch broke ground when she seized upon the possibilities provided by scientific analysis of surviving bronzes to explain the process of bronze casting. And that led her to sculptures that had just been found in a shipwreck off the coast of Italy, the remains of booty brought from the Greek world by Romans to decorate their mansions and villas. From there, Dr. Mattusch moved to a study of the villa of the Papyri near Herculaneum, near Pompeii, with its large collection of bronze sculpture, and now to the exhibit at the National Gallery on Pompeii and the Roman villa. Dr. Mattusch has written everything from simple handbooks to scholarly volumes. She has organized conferences and edited the published results. She has curated museum exhibits and even appeared on a video. I find it interesting and even ironic that Dr. Mattusch's work, which has taken us so far beyond the sculptural studies that originated in the antiquarian collections of European aristocrats and the great European national museums, she now brings us to the collectors not of modern times, or at least modern to us students of ancient studies, but to those Romans who lived in the later Roman Empire, Roman Republic in the early empire. And also that she curated the exhibit that's now being shown in our National Gallery. Please welcome Dr. Mattusch, who will be lecturing on her exhibit, Pompeii and the Roman Villa, exhibiting art and culture around the Bay of Naples.
Marilyn, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and to be here on a day when I can see the photography exhibition and see those interns about whom I've heard so much about their spectacular work on this project. It's really an exciting place to be now here. Let me tell you how I got into this exhibition. I studied, as Marilyn said, I studied a villa and its contents, a villa at ancient Herculaneum, and to the west of Mount Vesuvius. And the sites that I will show you materials from today include Herculaneum to the west, Pompeii to the south, and Stabii. There were villas all along this coastline, lining the coastline. So many villas were being built by the 1st century BC. The people complained about the garbage that was being dumped in the bay from construction. Sound familiar? Sound like where we live? At any rate, the villas continued, and towns, all the way around the Bay of Naples, the adjacent Bay of Pozzuoli, and here the town of Pozzuoli, or Puteoli, was the major port city for Rome until the 1st century AD. It was here that all the exotic imports came from around the Mediterranean, from Egypt, from the Near East. The grain came in from Egypt. Once Ostia was enlarged, it was closer to Rome, right by Rome, and so it was a logical place to switch to. But this was traditionally the big port. It was originally a Greek settlement. So was Naples, or Neapolis, the new city. Many of these sites were Greek, or they were named, like Herculaneum, after Hercules, after Greek heroes. And so there's a long Greek tradition in this region. The Villa of the Papyri that I studied first was full of sculpture collection in the classical and archaic styles. These were not imported from Greece, although some of the materials like the marbles were imported and some of the artists were imported to work these materials, but they were made locally, as far as I can tell, in traditional styles, in an echo of the classical past. Here's as I go along, I'll show you some images of the objects in the exhibition. As you walk through it on Friday, what you will see, I think, is a bit of my basic interests that have to do with context. First, the context in which such a collection was formed on the Bay of Naples, the summer homes where people went to get away from the office in Rome, to get away from negotium, or the negotiations of working in town. You would come to the equivalent of the Hamptons. On the Bay of Naples, you have your great summer villas. Open the windows on one side and you get the breeze off the lovely mountain, very fertile. Open on the other side and you look out on the gorgeous Bay of Naples, the island of Capri, and so forth. So people came here for their otium, their leisure, as opposed to their negotium in town, built some of them numerous villas of all sizes and shapes in different locations, and filled those villas with their art collections and with their decorative objects, many of them in the classical style. It is here that you would do your major entertaining. Your guests could talk with you about Epicurus, about Epicurean philosophy, or you could tell them about this sculpture that you just gotten that was in the style of so-and-so. So I'll show you a bit of these collections in the context that we have recreated of a Roman villa. In the exhibition, you'll walk into the front hall, the atrium. You'll go on into the interior, the tablinum, where sort of a salon where you would meet people, the dining room, the triclinium, the interior garden with its colonnade and its decor relating to the rural setting beyond. Then the art collections. None of this having to do with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. But then there's this little dark hallway at the end. And in fact, when my students went a week ago, they said, "Oh, we thought the show ended there." And I said, "Wait, the eruption." So don't forget the eruption and the aftermath, which has to do with the rediscovery in the 18th century of these sites around the Bay of Naples, from Pozzuoli to Stabiae to the Sorrentine Peninsula, and to the incredible finds which really opened up the classical world of painting and sculpture to 18th century collectors, viewers, and travelers. Of course, the aftermath is a lot more than the creation of styles in art history. The aftermath is also, what do you buy when you go to Pompeii on the grand tour? Who are the painters who were particularly successful at volcano paintings? How does Pompeiana, this craze for everything Pompeian, work its way into the consciousness of the 18th and 19th century European, British, and eventually American public? So the show is about the original context of such collections that these Romans formed in their vacation homes on the Bay of Naples, and about the context of the rediscovery in the 18th century. This fresco gives you a sense of what a seaside town looked like. You know, I'd love to say, oh yeah, this is Pozzuoli, but we don't know. It's just a harbor town and a vignette that someone had painted on the wall of a great villa. And you can see some of the buildings, the boats, the fishermen over here, the statues standing on the tops of columns, a lively, rather impressionistic scene. By the time Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, he had already initiated a number of public works in Campania, that region around the Bay of Naples and including the bay. For example, he had decided to extend one of the aqueducts and bring it all the way to Pompeii. That means water is much more accessible to the people of Pompeii by the late 1st century BC, and you begin to see at that time people building water features in their interior gardens just in quantity. Augustus himself had bought some houses around the Bay of Naples and also on the island of Capri, where his successor Tiberius, as many of you know, spent a number of years rather than being in Rome at all. Augustus had Livia behind him. There's a wonderful portrait of Livia in the exhibition made of basanite, which only comes from Egypt, and which the Egyptians reserved for images of gods. Of course, Roman Egypt comes along, and the Romans think, hey, the imperial family think, well, let's just use it for our own portraits as well. So Augustus is the driving force behind this real rebuilding around the Bay of Naples, this refurbishing. A lot of people are moving there so that they can be near him. He refurbishes the Acropolis or the Capitolium of Pozzuoli. And in the 1980s, they found these incredible sculptures in that area, the Acropolis of Pozzuoli, now known as Rione Terra, and a very dangerous area. But anyway, they found sculptures made like this one of Pentelic marble from Athens, others of Parian marble from Paros, perhaps carved by Greeks. There are 4 or 5 of these in the exhibition from Rione Terra, the Acropolis of Pozzuoli, and they are unbelievably beautifully executed. The undercutting is so deep you can't imagine how anybody get a tool in among those folds. And the style is, of course, in this case, this Aphrodite of the Munich Sion House type, I think it's called. The style is of the late 5th century BC. It's exquisite. You could see a face like this on the Parthenon. Everybody who was anybody, of course, tried to emulate the imperial family. If you couldn't have a seaside villa, you'd have a big house in town. If you could, you'd have that same interior garden, the same portraits in the front hall. And this is somebody named Gaius Cornelius Rufus, who is the pater familias of this household. His portrait was found in the front hall in 1863, as this photograph shows you, right next to the ceremonial table from the front hall, missing, it's probably inlaid wood top, but you see the table legs, marble carved with griffins, in the, just in front of the portrait of Gaius Cornelius Rufus. When you go in the first room of the exhibition, we have installed them in that same positioning, that same juxtaposition of the two as you see them in this photograph, in the interest of context. There are other portraits around the first room of the exhibit, and there are vignettes like these. This is a small image. It's about 18 inches square. It was cut in the 18th century from the wall of a villa at Stabii, and it's one of a whole series of images like this which seem to portray family members. Here's a woman sitting thoughtfully under a coffered ceiling. Wonderful sense of perspective in the rendering of that ceiling, but she may very well be a portrait of the lady of the house. Sometimes these portraits of people are dressed up a bit. You know, the lady of the house might want to be represented as Aphrodite, as in the case of another image in the exhibition. Some of the interior decor from these grand houses and villas is represented. This is the most incredibly elaborate lampstand that was found at Pompeii. It's made of bronze. It's inlaid with copper and tin or silver. And riding a panther is the baby Dionysus. He's holding his raiton, his drinking cup, aloft, because even though he's about 2 years old, he's already the drunken god. He's also riding towards a little bronze altar that has a stack of wood on the top and a little bronze flame. It's very cute. This is the sort of thing that you would have in your grand home with several lamps hanging from it. And all I think of when I look at something like this is, you know, I'd stub my toe on one of those feet because they would stick out into the room so unpleasantly. But you might have, along with your household gods, you'd have other small images that you particularly liked, maybe in the tabularium or in the triclinium, that is in your greeting room or in your dining room, things that you can talk about, including, this is a statuette that's about 6 inches high. I think it's a souvenir. It is a replica on a small scale of a very famous sculpture. It's got to be. There was at Didyma in Asia Minor a statue by the late archaic sculptor, Greek sculptor named Kanakos. There was a statue of Apollo called Apollo Philesios, and he supposedly held a laurel and a stag. And people wrote about this stag, that it's this wonderful kind of automaton, this little stag on the outstretched hand of Apollo, that you could pull a string underneath, all the way underneath, and the stag would move forwards so that it could handle this. This is such a curious combination of images that it's got to be a reference to that statue. The statue is represented on a number of coins from Didyma and nearby from later periods. It was, of course, like all the great Greek sculptures, stolen by the Persians, taken to Ecbatana, returned in the late 4th or the early 3rd century, sometime after Alexander the Great had visited Didyma. And then we find a number of Roman emperors having public works in Didyma. They, for example, Julius Caesar, Tiberius, and Caligula. Well, Julius Caesar and Tiberius were interested in the question of granting asylum to people in the Temple of Artemis. Caligula, I think, wanted a temple to himself built at Didyma. But it's clear that a lot of Romans traveled to Didyma. They saw some of the great works. The statue had been returned. I'd buy a souvenir, take it home with me, and this is evidently what we have in this little statuette. As you entertain people for dinner, you know, if you don't necessarily know them all that well, sometimes there's trouble thinking of what to talk about. And these Pompeian hosts had a whole assortment of available subjects that they could talk about. Like you might have a pair of silver cups, this is one of a pair, showing the labors of Heracles. And so you'd say, yeah, you know, there are 12 labors here, but these aren't the 12 I know. Now, which are the ones and you can imagine the conversation. These are unbelievably sophisticated in the production, and they're really heavy. The silver, and we have a number of pieces from the House of the Menander at Pompeii, it all has stamped on the bottom of each piece the weight of the silver. So you can imagine a guest thinking, oh, this can't be real silver. Turn it over and, oh, it is. And what's more, it weighs so and so much. So this is another way of saying you have really made it, and you've got a set of 180 pieces of silver like this, and that's how much they weigh. You find at Pompeii in a number of cases that people packed up their silver, as with the House of the Menander, had it in a chest ready to go, and they didn't make it out. Either they came back after the eruption and couldn't get it out, or they tried to escape with it and didn't make it. Usually the deaths are by the mephitic vapors, as opposed to being buried by ash, as we see in a lot of movies about the last days of Pompeii. The interior garden is where you would do a lot of entertaining. You have a little herb garden, flower garden, surrounded by a colonnade or colonnaded walkway. This is a whole wall of one such garden courtyard from behind the colonnade. The whole colonnade had on the walls all the way around garden frescoes. So you had your own garden in the center, as you'll see in the exhibition. And then you look out through the colonnade and the walls are all painted as if the garden goes on forever. You never have to weed this garden. Everything is blooming when you want it to bloom. And you've got a barn swallow, various types of doves, magpie, all kinds of your favorite birds. The website for the National Gallery has the bird songs of all of these birds, thanks to Richard Mason's friend Mark Walters in Naples, who's a bird person. But you know, even I'm not much of a flower person, but I look at this fresco, which was discovered in around the late 1970s or 1980s, so the colors are really good. It's huge. You know, how they ever got it there, I don't know. But it's a fairly thin, but you look at it and you can see oleander, palm, there's some ivy over there, viburnum, all these familiar plants which grew around the Bay of Naples in Roman times. They still do today, and they grow here as well. The garden sculpture is marble, but it's brightly painted, as the Romans did. You will see hanging theatrical masks. This is a herm, a head on a post, a satyr and a maenad, and then these marble plaques painted with maenads who are exhausted. They're resting after running through the forests after Dionysus. The bird bath in the center has water burbling up in the center. It's piped for water, and in fact these bird baths are piped for water. As you stand in that room of the exhibition, you'll see the garden fresco here, the garden itself here, the painted bird bath, a real bird bath, piped for water, as if these items have all climbed out of the fresco. Note the hanging theatrical masks. Another thing you would very likely have set into the wall of your colonnaded garden might be a relief in marble that's painted that shows Dionysus or Bacchus and his merry band. Here is Dionysus, his panther. He's wearing a panther skin on which you can see black spots. Look at the hair color on Dionysus, the satyr, and the maenad. The color is still preserved, still pretty bright. And if you go to the head of the procession with the maenad and her head thrown back and she's hitting her tambourine, look at the tambourine, because around her fingers are radiating little black lines that were painted to show that she's just whopped it and it's making a noise. Just like a cartoon, right? So lots of paint survives. There's spots here as well, and these were painted originally. Dionysus is a particularly appropriate figure for the garden, not just because of drinking and carousing and having a lot of fun, but his first role, of course, is that as of god of the theater, which explains why there's so many theatrical masks and dramatic items to be found in a garden. Many masks, either hanging in marble masks, or you will see masks in relief on plaques. And then, of course, there's Silenus, his old teacher and follower, drunk as can be, riding an inflated wineskin, which is piped for water so that water comes burbling out of the neck of this poor dead goatskin thing. This is a typical kind of bronze fountain sculpture. If it's not Silenus, it's a little Cupid or Eros holding a dolphin, and the dolphin is spewing water from its mouth. Getting to the art collections per se that these people had in their villas and large urban houses, there's an interesting mixture. This is a bronze bust that looks as if it had been cut from an archaic Greek statue of a kouros, frontal standing figure dedicated in a public space to, a god, or standing as a grave marker. They have all sorts of public functions, and they're a very standardized type. Yeah, but the Greeks didn't make busts. They made whole statues. And this is not cut from a statue, because if you look at the edge here, the irregular edge is a cast edge. It's a finished edge. Not only that, if you look at the back of him, there are these drips down the back. And those squiggly curls are sort of archaic, but no, they're archaizing. They're not really archaic. Don't you wonder whether the homeowner who spent a lot of money for this bust knew what it really was? Or did the homeowner buy this as something that had been rescued from a whole statue and brought back to Rome from Greece? We don't know whether they knew or not. In the early classical style, we have images like this. There are 5 of these girls in bronze from the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, from the garden. They all have different hairstyles, and they all have intact their original eyes. This is what the eyes looked like in bronze statues. When they're repaired in the 18th century, they repair the eyes to look as if they're bronze, as you see on this head. This is a modern repair. He would have had eyes like this too. Early travelers who saw this statue in the collections of the Spanish Bourbons who excavated the sites around the Bay of Naples just loved this statue, because if they kept writing in their travel logs and their journals, if you walk around to the side, you can see her bare breast. Well, just try it. There's really not much of anything to see there. But because she is the one they always wrote about, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if the museum would lend us this of all those 5 statues? And I didn't know what they'd say, because none of these had ever been lent anywhere before. And they said, well, she's standing at the end of a row of figures. That's okay, you can take her. So it was that easy, because she happened to be standing at the end of the row. They could take her down more easily. It's a little different with this one, who's never traveled since he was found in the 18th century. When we were going over the final list, the museum director in Naples said, "Did I agree to lend you that?" We said, "Yes, you certainly did." So we got this too. In addition to these, in addition to some of the new finds that have never traveled before, we've got old finds from the 18th century that have never traveled before, like these two. So much for the collections. I won't tell you today about the recreation of the entire Alexander mosaic from the House of the Faun, which you can walk on in the exhibition, but it's there. You will see it in this room with the classical and archaic sculpture collections. But you go through the dark hallway and you find yourself in a room full of eruptions. Vesuvius is erupting all around you. In one case, it is this de Valenciennes, which shows the death of Pliny on the coast at Stabii, right here. Pliny the Elder was so excited about the eruption for his works on natural history, he took a boat across the bay. He goes to the coast at Stabii and he starts getting his servants to help him take notes, and then he collapses and dies. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, didn't go with him. He stayed on the other side at Misenum, where he and his mother were. He was reading his history or something. He said, "Uncle, don't bother me. I'm doing my homework." But it turned out to be better, because he, in 2 later letters that he wrote to Tacitus, the historian, described in thorough detail all that he saw on this day in 79 AD, which is our best and most thorough description of the eruption. So on one side of this dark room, color of lava, you have the death of Pliny. On the other 2 walls in front of you, you see the eruptions as created by 2 highly successful volcano painters in the 18th and 19th centuries, Joseph Wright of Derby and Volaire, the very popular volcano painter who lived in Naples, and his paintings were always much in demand. In the middle of the room is this young woman, as if she's escaping from all of these eruptions. This is Nydia, the blind girl of Pompeii. She doesn't have anything to do with Pompeii except insofar as she is a creation of Edward Bulwer Lytton in the 19th century in his book, The Last Days of Pompeii. This seems so sappy to us now, this Nydia by Randolph Rogers, but you know, it's wonderful carving. You know how many examples of this were made in the 19th century? He made the original model for it, I think, in 1855, and by the time they were through producing Nydia, the blind girl from Pompeii, there were 167 examples in 2 different sizes coming out of the workshop. Not, of course, carved by Randolph Rogers, but carved in the shop where he left the model. So this was incredibly popular in the Victorian period. Once photography came onto the scene, photographs really took off at places like Pompeii, Giza, the Great Pyramids. Photographers could always sell individual works. They're cheaper than paintings or than gouaches, watercolors, or they could sell albums of photographs. And this is the kind of thing you would see from Pompeii after the 1860s, when Giuseppe Fiorelli, who was in charge of the excavations, figured out how to make plaster casts of these hollows in the dirt, which turned out to be dead bodies. And yes, we have the dead dog picture in the exhibition. But this is one of my favorite examples because it is so staged. They put a body lying here, expired, with his water jar that he's dropped beside him. This is not at all the way it was found, but it seemed like a good story to tell in this photograph by Amodio of 1870. And it's one of a whole album of photographs. If you would buy such an album in the late 19th century, there would be one of these. There would be a view of the city. There would be a couple of paintings. If you paid a little extra, you could probably get a pornographic image in there. You might have a picture of an orphanage in Naples as well in this little handbook of photographs, but all sorts of local color. Other types of images that sold very well were views of the ruins, quiet, unearthed. It looks as if somebody ought to be there, but they're not. And they'll have piled up sculptures or pieces of architecture. It looks like the Forum, sort of. But in fact, it's an invented view. It's an imaginary view. This by a Danish painter named Christian Kopke. And there's some goats in the background feeding in the middle of the ruins. And that beautiful mountain in the background, as if it's not a threat at all, but of course it is. And so you think about all of this, and you look at the lizards that he's painted scurrying across the ground, and you're supposed to think about the good and the bad all together. People would write about the eruption of Vesuvius in the 19th century, especially American missionaries, about how it was the wrath of the gods destroying these evil people for, oh, whatever you came to mind that you were upset about. But at the same time, this imagery of the ruins, of the sites that look as if, you know, they're in such wonderful shape, the paintings still on the walls, the furniture still in the front room. You find all sorts of tools and spoons and tables and the things that you use today. And what do you know? They use them in antiquity as well. So there is a feeling from the very beginning of how close these people were to ourselves in the 18th and the 19th centuries when tourists begin to come. By the 19th century, Pompeiana has spread throughout Europe and to America. Certain images are repeated over and over again. One of them is the galloping centaur on a black background. Another is the Maenad holding her tamarine or her whatever she's got in one hand, and her thyrsus, her stick with a pine cone in the other hand, flitting across a dark background. This gets repeated on the walls of stately homes in Germany, in Britain, and then it even comes to America. And you don't expect to see anything like this in a public building, but you know the nation's capital is, after all, a Roman city. The architecture is Roman. Why shouldn't the interior decor be Roman as well? And you go into the Capitol in Washington, you will see in the Senate Appropriations Conference Room this Maenad turned into decor on one of the walls of that room. These are the original designs that Constantine Brumidi made in the 1850s. He was hired to be the artist of the Capitol. And he painted a number of hallways. He painted the interior of the rotunda. But then some of this is Pompeian, purely Pompeian. This was his design for what was then the Naval Affairs Conference Room. And so there were all sorts of naval references. Each maiden on the wall was a maiden of the Navy. So one of them was holding a string of pearls. Another one was holding a fish. Another one an anchor. You get the idea, right? And then, of course, one of them is directly derived from this image from Pompeii, from the house of the ship, in fact, at Pompeii, found, I believe, in the 19th century. So thank you very much. If I could answer any questions or, yes?
After your extensive experience with thousands or hundreds of thousands of pieces of art, which one appeals to you most and why? Or which one do you appreciate the most, maybe your favorite art?
Of all of this?
Or just with
And they lent him for the exhibition. It was really exciting. Now my favorite changes often, but I like this because my background is in studying technology of sculpture, and this is not the way they make ancient bronzes. The way they tried to show on the outside that they made this bronze is fake. It's all made up. And so I find it to be pretty nice. Yes?
The first painting that you had up, was that a Roman painting or like ancient Roman or?
The first, yes it was. The Impressionist one?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
that's ancient Roman. It's in the first room of the exhibition, along with a couple of vignettes from Roman houses that show what a Roman villa looked like.
You mentioned one place that was dangerous. Did you mean then or now? You said this was a dangerous place.
Oh yeah, the Acropolis of Pozzuoli. That would be the local mafia. That would be what I meant. Yes.
Well, are they appropriating this stuff or?
I think they've pretty much finished the work that they're going to be doing in that location for the present. But as far as dangerous, there have been, I don't know how many TV programs and whatnot about Naples and Pompeii and about how incredibly dangerous it is to live there because there are so many people packed into this space. If they had to evacuate in case of an eruption, and there are 5 square miles of magma beneath Mount Vesuvius, which might blow at any time, nobody could get out of there. But nobody really cares, it seems, except the volcanologists. It's still today a beautiful region in which to live, the climate, the seafood, the everything. It's lovely, except for, of course, you've probably heard about the garbage. Where to dump the garbage has been a problem, a growing problem. Well, thank you again very much.
Some of you may want to come up and talk informally with Dr. Mattusch, and of course we have a little reception for you, so enjoy the exhibit. The student interns are here. You can talk to Dr. Mattusch, and I'm glad you all came.